My name is Clancy, and I'm an alcoholic. Now they've lost my talk. I'm very glad to be here tonight. Glad to be attending any AA meeting. Certainly glad to be part of this group and part of this meeting, which has been my home group for 29 years. This week, 29 years. Next week starts my 30th year as this is my home group, and it has continued. Faces have come and gone, and people have come and gone, and there are people who are 20 years sober who don't remember the people who were here 10 years before that. But the spirit stays the same, and it always continues to flourish, and I hope it always does. And I hope I can just survive while the leaders of tomorrow screw it up. But we don't have much time for badinage. They don't leave the speaker much time at this meeting. I asked her about dropping out one or two of the 10-minute speakers tonight, but not you, that short, pudgy, dark girl. But I used to drink alcohol. I spent much of my life drinking alcohol, and unlike many speakers I've heard in AA, I hear them say how they went through life defending their right to drink, and drinking was the focal spot of their life. I never really gave that much thought to drinking. Drinking was just a tool I used in order to get me through some bad feelings. It always seemed to me that my main problem was that my emotions were too intense, or I had feelings that were unusual to me, and I couldn't always identify them, but I could always feel them. In fact, most of my feelings I really couldn't identify with an overview until after I was sober sometime. Sometimes when working with others and I saw in them the emotions that I recognized myself, oh, that's what that was, and it's because I can see it in others. One of the funny things about working with other people, that's why we have sponsors, I guess, is that when you see someone, there's nothing between their problem and me except clean air, and I can spot their problem. But between my problem and me, there's a whole network of rationalizations and justifications and yes, but it isn't the way it seems, and on and on. But it always seemed to me I had a lot of emotions. And over the years, I've talked about these emotions at length, ad infinitum almost. But I suppose for the sake of a consensus opinion, the probably three general areas, and looking back over my life, seem to be the most continuingly painful. One was one I did not identify, but I felt most of my life. In fact, it wasn't until after I intermittently lost it that I began to realize that I'd had it so long. And that was nearly all of my life. I have to one extent or another had the feeling that I am not quite enough. I don't know why I'm not quite enough, and people never told me why I was not quite enough, but they acted kind of like I was not quite enough. And I didn't know what it was. I just knew that all things being equal, I will not be quite enough. They will like each other better than they like me. They will not include me on a continuing basis, which of course brings about an attendant thing that you must have gimmicks, you must have little tricks, you must have things to make yourself seem like more than you are. And in college, I discovered, I studied defense mechanisms. I had no idea what they were and just remembered them to pass the test. But that's really, in a sense, what a lot of people like me, and I presume like some of you have done, use defense mechanisms to cover up these feelings. And in my case, because I was a reader, although I was kind of an athletic person and was interested in athletics, I was a reader, and to me, the imitation intellectual defense always seemed to be the one I've slipped into, things like, well, what we've been discussing, I don't suppose you know what Nietzsche had to say about that, do you? No, I didn't think you did. Yeah. Keeps them at arm's reach. And there's a million of these things, and everybody's got them. And they all look different, because the other end of that same spectrum is exactly the same thing. It sounds entirely different. But the guy who says, I got a new Harley, I'm going to drive it up your ass. Same thing exactly. Same thing. Stay at a distance. Don't fight, I'm not quite enough. I thought the one thing that overcame that, would help me overcome it, was that I always had a great feeling of ambition. But since I've been sober and working with others, I've seen cases of that same type of ambition as I had, and it's not ambition. It's a sick obsession to prove something. I want to get to be something so I can prove to you I'm something. And there's never enough. You can get some, but pretty soon it wears off. And so there's never ending. Another great area of emotions in my life was I seem to be every so often just consumed by fear, cold fear. Now, I know everybody gets afraid, but they get down and out and they get afraid. I get afraid when I start to get successful again and again. And looking back, I never realized at the time. But I can start getting successful and working and get to be something. And all it takes is someone to criticize me, someone to write a letter of criticism, a note, a memo, implies that I'm not doing a good job. And the fear is there, and instinctively I want to destroy the people before they destroy me. Not destroy them with a gun, but destroy them with gossip and undercut them and do something and do everything I can. And we get in that kind of a situation where you can't take criticism without fear and despair and resentment and hostility. You're not going to last long anywhere, because everybody's going to get criticized. The last area of my life that I always felt was unique unto me, as far as I could tell, was that it always seemed to me I'm too vulnerable. Now, I know people have emotions and people have feelings, but people also aren't bound by everything. As they say, you can't do anything about the bullet with your name on it or the arrow with your name on it. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of arrows out there that are addressed to whom they may concern. You know. And people walk through life and they have their little suits of armor on. You're ping, ping, ha, ha, ha. And it just seemed to me, much of my life, my armor was stuck open. Just people say, "Oh, it's no big deal." Ping, ping. And, yes, it is a big deal. Just eat me up. So when I was a young man, I had these emotions, I had this ambition. I wanted to be something very much. And so when I was a young man, I didn't know what to do. I went to psychoanalysis. I didn't, they say, nay, you shouldn't go to psychoanalysis maybe, but I loved it. It brought me a great deal of insight and understanding. I discovered that I'd been psychologically warped by the Norwegian Lutheran Church. That's a good thing to find out. If I knew then what I know now, I would have formed adult children of Norwegian Lutherans. We could have hired a couple codependents and sat around and been pissed off every week. I discovered that I'd been psychologically scarred by the depression. Didn't even know there'd been a depression. When I found out, it hurt me a great deal. I found out that my parents had left me a deep sense of rejection because they'd gone away, and it wasn't until I was sober some years I started to remember I couldn't wait for them to go away. I'd like to be with my grandma, actually. But I had a lot of things, and there's always finding new things. I'll tell you something funny. As we went along, I thought about this later. The more bad things that seemed to me I found out, the better I felt. And I could not understand it. I never even thought about it, but it made me feel good. I wanted to go. I think that's why people go to psychoanalysis for 20 years. Maurice Zolotow, our old friend, went for 15 years. People go for years and years. Why do they go? You never get any better, but you feel better. Now, why do you feel better? I never could understand that till the last couple of years, and I noticed a phenomenon going on in the rapidly flourishing world of recovery, where everybody's in some form of recovery now. There's something that's available out there for people, even for people like you and me, that performs a miracle. Let me say this. Over the years, I've heard over 200 inventories. And I know alcoholics all over the world. And I know a lot of alcoholics. And I've talked to a lot of them in my office, so they come from all over the country to sit and talk about their problems. There's one thing that, in my experience, every alcoholic has when they come here. They may get rid of it later, but it's a long process. One is a deep-seated lack of self-worth, and one is a deep-seated feeling of guilt. The guilt has different reasons for it, but it's always there. And these are deep-seated feelings you cannot get rid of quickly. There's no way to get rid of them. And that's one of the reasons that I drank, because I discovered when I drank, at least I temporarily got rid of them. But there was no way to get rid of them. Now, what would you say if I told you there were some therapies available today that will help you will enable you to get rid of guilt? And there are such therapies available and will enable you to get rid of guilt, and I know of no other way for you and me to get rid of guilt except by drinking. And that's why it's such a siren song, and that's why people are drawn to it. And I don't have any feeling about it one way or another, whether they do it or not. But I'll tell you how you get rid of guilt. You find a therapeutic that convinces you that it was always somebody else's fault. They did this to me. I am a victim. And the great call, without even being aware of it, of the victimization therapy is this. When it's their fault, it's not my fault. I was just responding to forces beyond my control. And guilt is actually gone. Because whatever it is, it wasn't me. It was that. There's only one thing wrong with this. It's especially wrong for people like me. I presume like you, but I know for me, is that it's such a wonderful relief to get rid of that guilt. But like all things in the world, there are no free lunches. You have to pay a tab all the time for everything, sooner or later. And there's a little tab for that. And the tab is not a big red card on top. It's something you just unearth as you go along, and it keeps you ground down. And the tab is this. In order to sustain this feeling of their fault, I must sustain and enhance, without being aware of it, resentments. Because they have done this to me, and I reinforce those resentments on a continuing basis. If you talk to people coming out of these therapies, I'm not putting them down at all, but they get together with meetings, and believe me, I really have no opinion on it at all, because as long as it doesn't affect me. But they come out of the meetings, they never smile. They're always coming out because they've had to sustain and enhance feelings of resentment to keep rid of the guilt. They've had to sustain and enhance feelings of self-pity, because it's quite obvious. I would have been something if they hadn't done this to me, if these forces hadn't existed. And the third one, of course, is they must sustain and enhance the feelings of inherent being different. Because I would have fit in, I would have been part of things. But look what they did to me. They didn't mean to, but they've done it. And the problem with that for people like me is this. I read in that blue book, Alcoholics Anonymous, the three outstanding perils of people like me, the three great curses to me: resentment, self-pity, and feelings of difference. And so people like me feel better, but you must take on long-term feelings that you never really feel good, but you just have gotten rid of the guilt. And that's why it is such an enticing thing. We've seen a number of people leave our fellowship, leave this meeting, to go to places like that and say, you don't understand what we're finding here. We had a case just, 4 weeks ago. A guy who 2 years ago turns back, an alcoholic, we all know, turns back and found out that it was somebody else's fault. He's been living with that knowledge and going to meetings every week, and 3 weeks ago he finally hanged himself because he was so resentful of what had been done to him. And he used to feel good. And I'm not, as I say, I'm not really putting down those therapies because AA has no opinion on what they do. But I do have an opinion of this. I do not want to go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and hear them promulgating that stuff inside our meetings. If they want to do it, fine. If it's your parents' fault and it's their fault, if your inner child is bruised, fine. Go to a meeting where they discuss that and stay in the problem. Alcoholics Anonymous, we talk about actions that talk about recovery. And that's why a great many people find it difficult here because we get caught up in the problem without being caught up in the recovery. Now, don't misunderstand me. I know we've all got deep-seated scars. I'm sure everyone in this room has got things inside of them that at one time or another have just destroyed them. I certainly have had them. And there's no quick fix. But I'll tell you that AA gives you a fix eventually without a hidden price tag. I think probably the greatest example in my life, the one I've been talking a little bit about recently because I've thought about it a lot, is my father. Some of you know my father, but my father was when I was a little boy growing up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, he was a bright, able, piano-playing, joke-telling, funny, nice guy, and I loved him, and he just idolized him. But as I got older, late 30s, around 1940, it seemed to me that he was getting a little more distant, that he didn't seem as fascinated by me as he used to be, and I felt this kind of resistance, and I didn't understand why. And then he and my mother got a divorce, and I had never seen a divorce till they got divorced, and I took this as a personal rejection. I was a boy, 12 years old, and I hated him, and then he married this woman I hated. My mother married a guy I hated, and I'd never seen a divorce, but I fell into a thing that without ever seeing a divorce, if I'd have studied for 6 years, I couldn't have done it better, to drop right into the worst possible way. Without missing a beat, I began playing my mother against my father, and my father against my mother. My mother ground me, I'd run to my father. When my father ground me, I'd run to my mother. When they both ground me, I'd run to my grandma. And so 12, 13, and 14, when I should have been getting some structure in my life, seemed to me I reverted to childhood. In my 30s, I was still learning things that I should have learned when I was 13 years old. I could handle it. I had a little more veneer and I could pass it off. But by the time I was 15 years old, I mastered this patriotism because the war had just started, but I ran away. And I ran away to sea. I had my 16th birthday on a ship in Pearl Harbor. Dumb little skinny, pimply-faced dumbbell. And at the end of the war, fortunately, I was in a naval hospital and they were passing out tests they had left over. So I took a test, and I've always been good on tests, so I was able to get a high school equivalency. I'm still a beginning junior in high school. And I went to college after the war and got married in college. My father's relationship, I married this Catholic girl, which we joke about, but at that time it seemed that there were still a lot of feelings. My grandma was just devastated that I'd marry a Catholic. It's like today a Jewish mother, her son marrying a Goyish girl or something. It's just, really, it's a feeling there. And I thought my father and I had a little baby, a couple of little kids, and my father didn't seem to be very close. He always seemed to be more interested in that damn woman he married. And I really started to develop a resentment. And I loved him and I hated him. I loved him and I hated him. Finally the kiss-off came when I was drinking a little bit. And at the end of my college career, I was drinking, and I was in a jail one night. No big deal. Just overnight, getting a fight with a guy, getting a fight over a score of a football game. Who could remember it? And turned out he was a plainclothesman. He won. But I went to jail. And in the morning, and I was drunk, and my father came down in the morning at 6 o'clock, and he'd never came down to a jail cell before. And I thought, well, isn't this nice? Maybe I misjudged him. Maybe he's not so distant. Maybe he's come down to say, son, I haven't backed you up recently. I'm going to back you up now. And I said, how are you, Dad? And he seemed to have all kinds of emotions on his face. And he said, did you have a good time last night, son? I said, no, I didn't, Dad. I'm not going to do that anymore. I've learned my lesson. He said, these emotions, I hope you had a good time, because while you're out drunk, you let your little son die. He said, I just can't stand it. And away he went. And I thought, he just couldn't miss the chance to come down here and turn the screw on the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life. And I remember hollering at him, I didn't mean to! But man, there's nothing to be done. And I came out of there and I thought, worst couple of days of my life. Then they had a funeral. People came in from all over, relatives. And I sat there, and nobody said, I didn't really cause the child to die. He died, would have died if I'd been there now, because his mother was trying to keep him alive. But you feel that you caused his death, and they feel like you caused his death, I think. But I remember sitting at that funeral, sitting on sofas around our living room after the funeral, And all my relatives, brother-in-laws and sister, and all smiling at me. But I just see in their eyes, you dirty son of a bitch. And I thought to myself, yeah, I am. Look at my father. The one time I ever needed you, and you sit there and feel sorry for yourself with your little chin quivering because you lost your grandson. That's too bad. And I thought, to hell with you. And as far as I was concerned, except for a few brief things after that, I just didn't want to be around my father anymore. I wrote him off. I hated him. He ruined my life when I was a kid, and he ruined it when I was an adult. Now we jump ahead a number of years, and sober 8 months, 1969, and my sponsor said, well, you've written your inventory, and you've tried your 6th and 7th step. Now it's time to work your amends. That's your list here. There's a name's missing. Your father. I said, what? He said, your father, and I want you start off by making amends to him. And I said, you must be kidding. If anybody in the world owes me an amends, it's my father. He ruined my life. And I loved him, and I gave him everything I got, and he couldn't. He said, that may be true, son. We're not trying to help your father. Your father may have to live with pain all his life. We're trying to help you. He may have been a terrible father, but you were a terrible son. So we'll start off by writing him a letter and apologize. And I couldn't believe it. And then he said the terrible sentence that just I've said to others ever since. They don't like it any better than I do. And he said, and let me read it before you send it. So I finally brought him a letter, and no, not an indictment, a letter. So I sent him this letter, and he sent a note back, said, I'm glad you're all right. And I didn't even care what he thought. And he said, now send him a Christmas card. And I sent him a Christmas card. I hated it. Don't mind sending my mother one, and a birthday card. This went on for 2-3 years. Finally got a little job in a medical corporation. They sent me to Minneapolis on a job, and my sponsor said, go down and see your mother and see your father. And I didn't want to. But I went down and saw my mother, spent most of the day there, and finally at the end of the day, I had nothing else to do. I went over to my father's house, just like a little boy going to the dentist. I just didn't want to even see him. But I opened, and the door opened, and at least he had shrunk from this tall to this tall, and but he said, come in. And I said, I don't think I want to come in. And then I guess he sensed how I felt. He said, well, it's all right. My wife knows that you were coming, so she's left the house. I said, okay. I came in and sat down and talked to him for a while. I couldn't wait to get out of there because I just thought, I hope you're happy. I hope you got everything you nice because you ruined my life. And then a year later, I was back there in Minneapolis again, did the same thing. Saw him again, didn't want to. Now we jumped to 1963. I was sober 5 years. And my wife and children joined me. I'd been living alone in Los Angeles, rather comfortably, as a matter of fact. and they came out here, and I'd been getting a little juice in meetings by saying, yes, my wife and children are gone. I'll never see them again, but I'm bravely going through, and isn't that wonderful? And now all of a sudden, here they were back. God, kids and dogs and noise and screaming, and couldn't get in the bathroom, and just crazed, and just go to a meeting, try to get some sympathy. Oh, you must be happy now. They're all back, huh? I was crazed, and I got a call from my father suddenly. He said, son, I don't know how to. He said, my wife suddenly died last night of a heart attack. He said, I know we haven't been very close, but could you come up and help me get through this? I don't know how I can get through this. And I'll tell you something. If I had been living alone and comfortable, I'm very sure I would have said no. I'd have said, well, Dad, why didn't you work it out like I had to do myself? But I thought about this house and, yes, I will. And I went up there and we went through the funeral and everything, and And the night after the funeral, we were sitting up drinking coffee at all hours, and somehow we got talking about, and he got talking about, in a sense, his perception of what our relationship had been, and I couldn't believe my ears. He talked about how he had so loved me as a boy. I was his only child. He worked 2 jobs so I could have things that other kids didn't have. As I got older, I seemed to get more sassy and insolent, and he didn't know what it was. He just thought he'd just back off a little bit and let me get through the phrase. And then he and my mother had come to parting of the ways, and I'd never known it, but they'd decided for some time to separate. And he said he didn't want to do anything to jar me. He tried to make it as easy as possible. And then he got married, and all of a sudden I seemed to have touched a terrible reaction to he and his wife, and he didn't know why. Then after the war, I came home, and I was drinking and loud and noisy, and he'd try to talk to me about things, and he was brushing him off, and it broke his heart. And then I said, and he talked to me about how bad it was when he came down he wanted to open the cell and come in and hug me when he told me about my son. But it seemed to him that he saw hate in my eyes, and I told him, I acted as though I didn't want him around, so he just staggered off. In the same thing, from an entirely different point of view, I'll tell you, I couldn't believe my ears. And we didn't become exactly close chums right then, but little by little we did. And for the next over 20 years, we were closer than most fathers and sons I ever knew. And he's been to this meeting, came out here when he got old and feeble, and lived with us in our house. Came to this meeting, know a lot of people in this room, always telling jokes, always having fun. And he got to be like an old elephant, to go back to the elephant burial grounds when he was dying, and he went back to Wisconsin, passed away. And I remember sitting at the funeral in the Norwegian Lutheran Church, and so there's a little casket. I was thinking, I'm so glad he died, got out of his pain. I looked around that church and thought, isn't that wonderful? Because of Alcoholics Anonymous, for the first time in my life, I can sit in this church and believe the God that's in here is the loving God, the same kind of God that's in my meeting in West Los Angeles, not that Norwegian Lutheran God that's waiting for me to slip once. And it was a great thing. Now, the reason I told you all that is not for any great reason except for this. If I had not been driven to take actions in Alcoholics Anonymous, if I could have found a victimization therapy to stay in, to this day, all these years later, when I heard his name, I would have said, damn him. Damn him! And instead I have a loving and friendly reminder of my father. So it really, the point I'm trying to make is that you and I got to be very careful that we don't slide into that easy fix of victimization, because it'll ruin your life, even though you've been victimized, because there's ways out. But I went into psychoanalysis, I went into metaphysics, I went into a lot of things. I had jobs, I did all the things all these years with all these feelings. But probably the number one help I had was that came from alcohol. I discovered as a boy, 15 years old, on the deck of a ship, that drinking made me feel significantly better. And I used drinking from then on. I didn't become a terrible old drunk, but it made me feel significantly better. And after the war, I came home and I drank, and I was in the first class of the veterans after the Second World War. As Clint used to describe it, stand on street corners looking like a steely-eyed, sex-crazed killer and wondering if our unemployment check would come on time this week, or a 5220 club. And sometimes I drank too much, and I was sent to my first AA meeting in 1949, a long time ago. But it had nothing for me. There wasn't anybody within 15 years of me in that state. And so I went to psychoanalysis in the upcoming years, and I had some jobs and did all sorts of things. Eventually, I drank to extreme and leave jobs and get better jobs and reunite with my family. Chaos. But finally, the day came, as most of us know, have ever heard me talk, that much to my surprise, I found myself being thrown out of a Skid Row mission physically into the street. And I tried to explain to the guy, I'm not a bum. 3 years ago, I was on the faculty of the University of Texas. My family, my kids came and sat and watched an opera that I directed. Ads that I helped write were running that very week in Life and Time, the old Elsie Nelmer ads, Life and Time and Saturday Evening Post and Collier's. I've had my picture in the New York Times for achievement. How many people do you know have had their picture in the New York Times for achievement? But it's hard to explain these things in midair, you just... And unfortunately, I'd had my front teeth kicked out about a month before that, so I wasn't hitting those consonants quite as cleanly as I'd like. But I stood outside of that mission. If a guy would come up to me and said, "Are you an alcoholic?" I'd have to say, "No, I'm not, but I wish I were." I've been going to AA meetings year after year. I've been in psychoanalysis. The main difference between alcoholics and me is this. Alcoholics are people whose problem is alcohol. And I sometimes have a problem with alcohol, but unlike them, it's worse when I don't drink. That's why I drink. I drink to ease off the terrible pain of not drinking. There's something wrong with me, and a psychiatrist couldn't find it, and my readings of Nietzsche couldn't find it. I'll tell you, if you are like me, you'll discover that a few drinks will make you feel better than 2 years of psychoanalysis. A few drinks will make the day better than an understanding of the Nietzschean theory of the Übermensch. A few drinks will just make you feel better. And the trouble is, sometimes I drink too much. And I remember once I worked out a theory on that, after I'd been psychoanalysis, that as a child I'd been like a spring that had been coiled. And as nature, as you grow up, the spring gradually releases. But because of the victimization I'd had, I'd been kept like this. And now when I drank, it gave me relief. And I went, oh. And it's perfectly normal, except people didn't understand it. And I like that explanation. I never could sell it to any cops. I sure tried. I said, no. Oh, shit. But I knew I wasn't an alcoholic. I didn't know what was wrong with me, but I knew there was something dreadfully wrong with me. And I walked 71 blocks out to the corner of Wilshire and Fairfax where the Orbeck store now used to be a little AA club. I hung around there, and I was conditioned that Vince always talks about. But I was there first, of course. Desperation, fear, loneliness, and absolutely certain nothing they could do could help me. Because I could quote the book better than the people who were trying to help me. I knew about the steps, I knew all about all these things, but there's something deeper. And it turned out that eventually, through pain and agony, I got a sponsor finally who didn't seem to understand that sponsors are to share, not tell. And he told me, and just terrible. I was living in the backseat of an abandoned car in the parking lot. And I tried to explain to him, Bob, I don't think you understand. You have me doing these little things. I know that you mean well, Bob, but I'm not some newcomer. I've been in and out of AA for years. I've got deep-seated conflicts, and I'm suicidal. I've been in the insane asylum for suicide. Bob, AA is not enough for cases like mine. Emotions are too frayed. In my judgment, this can't work for me. And he would explain things like, he'd say, in your judgment? Who cares about your damn judgment? You live in an abandoned car, for Christ's sake. Oh yeah, I never thought of that. No? And I'll think later, what kind of an answer is that? I must say, in the last 30 years, I've been talking about that sponsor, and I've been quoting him as talking like that. And someone pointed out to me a year or two ago that knew him. He never talked like that once. That's the way I heard him. But he never talked like that. He always talked. But he finally intimidated me doing something that little by little I had no idea would change my life. He intimidated me into beginning to take actions. And one of the ways that helped me begin to take action when I began to realize, finally, I was about to get drunk again, I suddenly realized I can take these actions, but I don't have to mean them. Don't get caught in the trap of thinking you have to mean them. I can ridicule this fool while I take the action, and I'll feel better. After that, it became something. Clancy, pick up the cups. Sure, Bob. And I could think, you know why you don't get any more parts in movies? Because you're ugly and you're stupid. He said, Clancy, help set up the meeting. Sure, Bob. I bet you could too if you could figure out how to unfold the chairs. Clancy, thank the speaker. Sure, Bob. I'm used to dealing with hypocrites after talking to you. I became something of an activist. And the next month, I had a job, somebody got me a job as a dishwasher, and I got fired after 3 days, and the balloon went up. All of it was just a joke. Just a joke. And that day I decided to kill myself. 6 months sober, I can't hold a job as a dishwasher. I can't think of a single person that I know will accept a collect phone call from me in America. And I called my sponsor, and I guess those actions got me to call my sponsor, because I wouldn't have done it ordinarily. And he cursed me into writing an inventory that I swore I would never write, because I'd taken my inventory with a psychiatrist. But he cursed me into writing an inventory. And a couple weeks later, he drove me along Pacific Coast Highway. Many of you have been up there with me. And me with my flashlight and my paper, and him driving, and me saying the things that all people say when they have a good inventory. Now, let me explain this part first. It isn't the way it sounds. I didn't know she was only 7. That is not from my inventory. That's just a figure of speech. I have enough heat without taking that kind of crap. And I survived. And I got another little job. And I lost that. But I survived. And 2 months later, one day he said, Clancy, you've done your steps now. Time to do your inventory. Time to do your amends. Put your name, your dad's name. And I said, what? But I'd taken enough action, so I put my dad's name and started that process. And I stayed sober. I became an activist. And I've stayed sober ever since, and I think the greatest gift of my life was being driven into being an activist. I feel so sorry for people who come to AA and insist on trying to find out what they can get by with not doing, because you deprive yourself of such a thing, and there's no way to underbelieve it, because it doesn't seem like there's no logic to it. And when my sponsor, he finally got mad at AA. He found the Pacific Palisades meeting, and they changed the format, and he did some other things, and he stopped going to AA. I said, Bob, this is not good. He said, I took you out of an abandoned car. Don't tell me what I should do. So we finally got drunk and died. And people said to me, boy, I hope this is going to make you throw you over. You're none too stable anyway, but your sponsor getting drunk? No, I said, that makes me stronger. It proves what he said was right. He always said, if you don't do these things, you'll get drunk. And he stopped doing them, and he got drunk. And eventually, after a little while of sponsoring myself and finding I wasn't getting good information, I just couldn't understand it. I got another sponsor, a guy I didn't particularly care for because he was a smarmy spiritual leader and the kind of people I don't like. But he was the most active man that I knew of in the world at AA. I wanted someone to pull me along through activism. I can philosophize with anybody. I can exchange words with anybody. But I need someone to say, here, let's do it, not here, you do it while I think. And I followed him, and he was my sponsor for many, many years, and I survived. And I certainly, as has been said before in AA meetings, it's certainly true. A lot of times people say to me, a couple of months ago, I was talking somewhere, and I remember suddenly thought, tonight I've been sober a third of a century, exactly, 33 years and 4 months. That's a long time. By now, you'd think I would have turned into something really wonderful, but I still have learned that you keep plugging and you don't ever become truly wonderful. As has been said, again, people sometimes say to me, well, Clancy, sometimes you don't act like the way you don't walk the way you talk. And I wanted to tell him, that's true, but you can thank Christ I don't walk the way I think. There are actions here for me to take, and actions for you to take. And every one I've discovered in AA, when I allow them, become a part of the picket fence between me and the abyss. I've got some wonderful things out of AA. I have worked steady for a lot of years, and I've had my family back and watched them grow up and watch grandchildren. They're all doing well, and my oldest daughter is a prosecutor in New Mexico. And when she was home at Christmas, she said, she said, remember that when I was a little girl, you sent me to my room? I said, yes, honey, but did this for your own good. She said, that's right. She says, when you come to New Mexico, I'm going to send you to a little room. She's kidding, but I just don't go down there anymore. But I have 3 daughters in AA who I love and am proud of. One of them here tonight. I have a couple kids who aren't in AA. I have a lot of nice things. But you know, once upon a time, when I was in the Texas Insane Asylum, I'd been given a lot of shock treatments because I had been refractory. And I finally, so the only way I was ever going to get out of here, I'd have to get transferred to out of that psychiatric ward. They had an alcoholic ward. I thought, I'll pretend to be an alcoholic, I'll get in there. So I got in the alcoholic ward, and I've been going to AA for 6, 7 years by this time. I knew how to play their sick little game. And I don't know if you've ever been in Texas, but they open their meetings down there a little different than much of the South they do here. For instance, now here I get up and say, my name is Sam, and I'm an alcoholic. Everybody says, hi, Sam. Down there, coming off shock treatment, someone at the alcoholic ward, and the first thing they heard, the guy said, my name is Fred, and I'm an alcoholic. And through the grace of God and the power of this simple program, it has not been necessary for me to drink any alcohol or take any mind-sedating or tranquilizing medications since my sobriety date. And for this, I'm truly grateful. Then they say, hi, Fred. And when you're just coming off shock treatments, and I always swore if I got in a position of power or have a chance to talk and tell people what things really are like, I wouldn't give them some rotten cant like that. I'd talk from my experience. So I am glad to tell you that in my experience, I learned after I was in AA sometime that my problem is I'm an alcoholic, the strange condition of sobriety and drinking both. So I can say, my name is Clancy, but I'm an alcoholic. And what I've learned is this, that through the grace of God and the power of this simple program, it has not been necessary for me to drink any alcohol or take any mind-sedating or tranquilizing medications since October the 31st, 1958. And for this, I am truly grateful. Thank you.
Turn the tape over now, please.